The trading post fell silent as Elizabeth Harmon was pushed forward, her father's gambling debts now her burden to bear. Trembling in her faded dress, she kept her eyes down as the Apache warrior called Shadow Wolf approached. His reputation as fierce and merciless preceded him. The townspeople watched with cold curiosity, expecting brutality to follow. But when he lifted her chin with one finger, the gentleness in his touch confused everyone present. Without a word, he wrapped his blanket around her shoulders and led her away. Behind them, whispers erupted. Could a woman given away like property find something in captivity she never had in freedom? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elizabeth clutched the silver locket at her throat as Shadow Wolf led her from the trading post. The small oval pendant contained the only image she had of her mother. A faded daguerreotype taken before consumption had hollowed her cheeks and dimmed her eyes. The locket was the only possession her father had allowed her to keep over the years. Not out of sentiment, but because it was too worn to fetch a decent price at the pawn shop. 22 years she had lived in Bitter Creek, and not once had she felt as though she belonged. Her mother had been kind but frail, passing when Elizabeth was only 7. After that, her father transformed from a stern but tolerable man into a monster who drowned his grief in whiskey and gambling. "Girl," he would bellow, backhand already raised. "Where's my supper?" Or his clean shirt? Or the money he was certain she had stolen, when in truth it had been lost the night before at the saloon's poker table? Elizabeth's gaze slid sideways at the Apache warrior who walked silently beside her. His face revealed nothing, bronze features impassive beneath the raven hair that hung to his shoulders. Yet she remembered the unexpected gentleness of his finger under her chin, so at odds with the stories that had circulated through town. Shadow Wolf, they called him. The whispers said he moved through darkness like a spirit, appearing from nowhere to lead raids on caravans and isolated homesteads. They said he had slaughtered entire families, that he collected white scalps, that he had been educated at an Indian school before rejecting the white man's ways in a bloody rebellion. Devil savage, her father had spat that morning, as he roughly braided her hair. But he's agreed to clear my debt for you, and Jameson won't wait any longer. His fingers had dug painfully into her shoulders. Pretty thing like you might soften him up. Might even survive if you're obliging enough. The silver locket pressed against her skin as they walked farther from the only home she had known. Not much of a home. A place where she had been little more than a servant, where her father's belt had left scars across her back, where the townsmen had eyed her with a hunger that had grown more predatory as she matured. Elizabeth's steps faltered as they reached the edge of the pine forest that marked the unofficial boundary between the settlement lands and Apache territory. Shadow Wolf paused, dark eyes studying her face. He made no move to grab her, to force her forward. Instead, he waited with a patience that seemed boundless. This was her chance to run, to flee back to town or perhaps even farther, to the stagecoach stop 20 miles south. But what awaited her there? More servitude? Another master no better than her father? She straightened her shoulders and stepped past Shadow Wolf into the shadows between the pines. If death awaited her in those mountains, at least it would be her choice. The first real choice she had ever made. The silver locket caught the last rays of sunlight as they vanished into the forest, leaving Bitter Creek behind. They traveled in silence as the sun arced across the sky. Elizabeth's thin-soled boots, already worn from years of use, developed fresh blisters that burned with each step. Still, she refused to complain. Whatever fate awaited her, she would meet it with what little dignity remained to her. Shadow Wolf moved with the fluid grace of a man who knew the land intimately. He paused occasionally, waiting when the terrain grew steeper, but never offering assistance. Elizabeth was grateful for this small mercy, the absence of unwanted touch. By midday they reached a swift-running creek. Shadow Wolf knelt, drinking deeply before gesturing for her to do the same. As she cupped the cold water to her lips, she noticed an eagle feather secured with a leather thong in his hair. The black and white markings caught her eye, intricate, meaningful in ways she couldn't fathom. He caught her staring and, to her surprise, removed the feather, extending it toward her. I don't understand, she said, her voice rusty from disuse. Gaia Jen, he replied, tapping his chest. Shadow Wolf. His English carried an accent but was clear enough. The revelation that he spoke English startled her. She had assumed their transaction had been conducted through a translator at the trading post. Elizabeth, she offered hesitantly, pointing to herself. Elizabeth, he repeated carefully, still holding out the feather. When she made no move to take it, he stepped closer, slowly reaching toward her hair. She flinched instinctively, but he merely tucked the feather behind her ear, his fingertips barely grazing her skin. Eagle sees far, he said. Sees true path. She touched the feather gingerly, confused by the gesture. Was this a tribal marking? Some indication of ownership? Shadow Wolf watched her for a moment, then turned to continue their journey. Elizabeth followed, the eagle feather still in her hair, unsure of its significance but unwilling to remove what seemed to be a deliberate gift. They traveled until dusk deepened the shadows between the pines. Shadow Wolf led her to a small clearing where the remnants of an old campfire indicated previous use. Without instruction, he began gathering firewood while Elizabeth stood awkwardly, uncertain of her role. After watching his methodical preparation, she began collecting smaller twigs for kindling. When she placed them beside his larger branches, he nodded once, the first acknowledgement of her assistance. The fire caught quickly under his experienced hands. In its dancing light, Shadow Wolf removed a small pouch from his belt, extracting strips of dried meat which he offered to her first. Elizabeth accepted cautiously, the unfamiliar taste of venison jerky strange but not unpleasant on her tongue. Tomorrow, we reach my people, Shadow Wolf said as the night deepened around them. Elizabeth's stomach tightened with renewed anxiety. What will happen to me there? Shadow Wolf studied her across the flames, his expression revealing nothing. You will live. As what? She pressed, surprising herself with her boldness. A slave? Wife. The latter word caught in her throat. As Elizabeth, he answered simply. She clutched her mother's locket, unsatisfied with his cryptic response yet unable to demand more. The night wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, a lonely, haunting sound. Shadow Wolf extended his blanket toward her. Sleep. Long walk tomorrow. Elizabeth wrapped herself in the rough wool, keeping the fire between them as she lay down on the hard ground. The eagle feather was still tucked behind her ear, a strange talisman from a man she had been raised to fear. Sleep came slowly, in fits and starts, but the anticipated danger never materialized. Shadow Wolf remained on his side of the fire, a silent sentinel against the night. The Apache camp appeared first as wisps of smoke rising above the juniper trees, then as the muted sounds of daily life, children's laughter, the rhythmic scraping of tools against wood, the low murmur of conversations that ceased as Shadow Wolf led Elizabeth into their midst. Women paused in their work, men straightened from their tasks, and children stared openly at the white woman with the eagle feather in her hair. Elizabeth felt the weight of their collective gaze, some curious, others hostile. She kept her eyes lowered, acutely aware of her faded dress and tangled hair. Shadow Wolf spoke in Apache, his deep voice carrying across the clearing. Though Elizabeth couldn't understand his words, she recognized the cadence of explanation, perhaps even reassurance. An older man stepped forward, his face deeply lined, his bearing that of authority. He studied Elizabeth with piercing eyes before responding to Shadow Wolf in clipped tones. The exchange continued, growing more heated until a wizened woman emerged from the largest wickiup. Her silver hair hung in two long braids adorned with beads that clicked softly as she approached. With a single sharp word, she silenced both men. She circled Elizabeth slowly, her weathered hand reaching out to touch the eagle feather, then Elizabeth's pale hair. Her dark eyes, remarkably similar to Shadow Wolf's, held neither welcome nor hostility, only assessment. "Grandmother," Shadow Wolf said in English, clearly for Elizabeth's benefit. "This is Elizabeth." The old woman nodded once, then spoke rapidly in Apache. Shadow Wolf replied, gesturing toward the edge of the camp where several smaller dwellings stood. "Come," he said to Elizabeth, "I show you where to stay." As they crossed the camp, Elizabeth felt the stairs following them. A young woman spat on the ground as they passed, earning a sharp rebuke from Shadow Wolf. The wickiup he led her to was small but solidly constructed, the framework of juniper branches covered with animal hides and woven mats. Inside, a bedroll of soft furs lay beside a small fire pit. The space was clean and simple, offering more privacy than Elizabeth had known in her father's one-room cabin. "You stay here," Shadow Wolf said. "No one will harm you." Before Elizabeth could respond, the old woman appeared in the entrance, carrying a clay bowl filled with water. She placed it in Elizabeth's hands with a stream of words Elizabeth couldn't understand. "My grandmother says you must be thirsty after your journey," Shadow Wolf translated. "She welcomes you to our band." Elizabeth accepted the bowl with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered, both to Shadow Wolf and his grandmother. The old woman watched as Elizabeth drank, nodding with apparent approval. She spoke again to Shadow Wolf before departing. "What did she say?" Elizabeth asked. A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, crossed Shadow Wolf's face. "She says you are too thin, that my grandfather paid too much." Elizabeth stiffened, reminded sharply of her status as property, as a transaction. Seeing her reaction, Shadow Wolf added, "Grandmother's way of joking. She says all men pay too much for wives." "I'm not your wife," Elizabeth said quickly, heat rising to her cheeks. Shadow Wolf regarded her steadily. "No, not wife." He turned to leave but paused at the entrance. "Rest now. Later, food." Left alone, Elizabeth sank onto the fur bedroll, the clay water bowl still clutched in her hands. Its rough texture grounded her in this new reality, a reality where she was neither prisoner nor wife, yet somehow both. Outside, life in the camp resumed. Women called to children, men conversed in low tones, and somewhere nearby, a rhythmic drumming began. Elizabeth placed the water bowl carefully beside her bed. Her first possession in the strange new world. Dawn arrived with the soft patter of footsteps outside Elizabeth's wickiup. Shadow Wolf's grandmother entered without ceremony, gesturing for Elizabeth to follow. Outside, the camp was already alive with activity. Women grinding corn between stones, men checking weapons, children carrying water from the nearby stream. The old woman, whose name Elizabeth learned was Nazcha, led her to a group of women preparing the morning meal. With patient gestures, Nazcha demonstrated how to shape the cornmeal dough into flat cakes for cooking. Elizabeth's first attempts were clumsy, earning sideways glances from the other women, but Nazcha nodded encouragingly. Days passed in a blur of new tasks and unfamiliar customs. Elizabeth's hands grew calloused from grinding corn, scraping hides, and weaving baskets. Her fair skin reddened under the relentless sun until Nazcha showed her how to make a protective salve from desert plants. Shadow Wolf remained distant, appearing only occasionally to check on her progress or translate a complex instruction. Elizabeth found herself watching for him, curious about the man who had paid for her yet demanded nothing. On the fifth morning, Elizabeth emerged from her wickiup to find a pair of handcrafted deerskin moccasins placed outside her door. She examined them with wonder. The soft leather decorated with porcupine quills in a sunburst pattern, the soles sturdy yet flexible. When she slipped them on, They fit perfectly, cradling her blistered feet like a healing embrace. "They suit you," Shadow Wolf's voice came from behind her. Elizabeth turned, the moccasins silent on the packed earth. "Did you make these?" He nodded once. "Your boots were not good for our land." "Thank you," she said, genuinely moved by the thoughtful gift. "They're beautiful." Something shifted in Shadow Wolf's expression, a softening around the eyes, quickly masked. "Today I show you plants. Which to eat, which to heal." The day passed with Shadow Wolf pointing out various desert plants, those that provided food, medicine, and materials for tools or shelter. Elizabeth listened intently, storing away the knowledge that might mean survival in this harsh landscape. "The white people," she ventured as they walked back to camp. "They say, your people are savages. But I've seen nothing but wisdom in how you live with the land." Shadow Wolf was silent for so long that Elizabeth feared she had offended him. Finally, he spoke. "The white man takes without giving back, kills what he cannot use, sees land as something to own." He gestured to the mountains surrounding them. "How can anyone own the earth, the sky, the water? These belong to all who live." His words resonated with something deep within Elizabeth, a truth she had somehow always known but never articulated. That evening, as Elizabeth sat with Nazcha learning to stitch a torn hide, she noticed several young women watching her with less hostility than before. One approached, hesitantly offering a small pot of berry juice for dyeing leather. Elizabeth accepted with a smile and a word of thanks in Apache that she had carefully practiced. The woman looked surprised, then pleased, responding with a phrase Elizabeth didn't understand but recognized as friendly. Later, alone in her wickiup, Elizabeth traced the intricate quillwork on her new moccasins by firelight. Her old boots sat discarded in the corner, a relic of her former life that no longer seemed to fit. Outside, the night was filled with the sounds of the camp settling into sleep, murmured conversations, a distant flute playing a haunting melody, the soft shuffle of moccasined feet on earth. Elizabeth realized with a start that she felt safer here, among those her father had called savages, than she ever had in Bitter Creek. Elizabeth had been with the Apache for nearly a moon cycle when the hunting party returned earlier than expected, their expressions grim. Shadow Wolf moved immediately to confer with the tribal elders, his usual composed demeanor replaced by tense alertness. From her place near the cooking fires, Elizabeth watched the gathering of men. Their voices remained low, but their gestures conveyed urgency. Nazcha approached, settling beside her with a sigh. "Trouble comes," the old woman said in her limited English. She had been teaching Elizabeth Apache while learning English words in return, their daily exchanges becoming a bridge between worlds. "What kind of trouble?" Elizabeth asked, her hands stilling on the basket she was weaving. Nazcha pointed west, toward white settlements. "Blue coats. Many." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. Cavalry soldiers meant only one thing in Apache territory: conflict. That evening, as Elizabeth brought water to her wickiup, Shadow Wolf approached. In his hand he held a brass telescope, military issue, the kind officers carried. "Our scouts found this," he said without preamble. "The soldiers have set camp at Red Rock Canyon. 20 men. More coming." Elizabeth studied the telescope, its polished surface reflecting the fading sunlight. "Did your people take it?" A flash of anger crossed Shadow Wolf's face. "We do not steal. It was dropped." The soldier was mapping our hunting grounds. He extended the telescope. "Can you read the marking?" Elizabeth examined the inscription on the brass tube. "Property of U.S. Cavalry, 7th Regiment. Captain J.W. Thornton." The name struck her with cold recognition. Thornton is known for his hatred of Indians. He led the massacre at Pine Creek last year. "You know this man?" "Of him," Elizabeth clarified. "He came to Bitter Creek once. Spoke of his Indian campaigns like he was describing a hunt." She handed back the telescope, her fingers brushing Shadow Wolf's. If he's leading the soldiers, there will be violence. Shadow Wolf's eyes held hers. The council meets tonight. You should come. The request surprised her. Me? Why would the council want to hear from a white woman? Because you understand the bluecoats' ways. They're thinking. His voice lowered. Some warriors want to strike first. I seek another path. That night, Elizabeth sat at the edge of the council circle, conscious of curious and suspicious glances. The tribal elders spoke in Apache, with Shadow Wolf occasionally translating key points for her benefit. Maps drawn in the dirt showed cavalry movements encircling traditional Apache hunting grounds. One warrior argued passionately for immediate attack, while others counseled retreat to the higher mountains. When Shadow Wolf finally spoke, his words carried the weight of authority. Elizabeth couldn't understand everything, but she recognized his measured tone, seeking balance between protection and provocation. Finally, he turned to her. Tell them what you know of this Captain Thornton. Elizabeth swallowed hard, aware that every eye was upon her. Captain Thornton believes all Apache are enemies of the white man. He will not distinguish between peaceful bands and those who raid. He seeks glory through victory, not peace through understanding. Shadow Wolf translated, then asked, would he attack without cause? Yes, Elizabeth answered without hesitation. He would create a cause if none existed. Murmurs rippled through the council. The elder who had been advocating for attack spoke rapidly, pointing at Elizabeth with obvious suspicion. Shadow Wolf's response was calm but firm. When he finished, the elder subsided, though his expression remained hostile. What did he say? Elizabeth asked quietly. He questions your loyalty, Shadow Wolf replied. Wonders if you warn us only to save yourself. Elizabeth straightened her spine. I have no loyalty to men like Thornton, or to Bitter Creek. They threw me away like unwanted goods. Her words, translated by Shadow Wolf, brought a moment of silence to the council. The oldest elder, his face deeply lined with age, studied her for a long moment before speaking. As the council dispersed, Shadow Wolf explained their decision. Scouts would monitor the soldiers' movements while the camp prepared for possible evacuation. Your words helped, he said simply. Thank you. In that moment, standing under the vast starlit sky, Elizabeth realized she had chosen a side in the coming conflict, and it was not with those who shared her skin color. The threat of cavalry soldiers changed the rhythm of camp life. Scouts departed daily, families packed essential belongings, and hunting parties ventured out with greater caution. Through it all, Elizabeth found her place within the tribe solidifying. Women who had once avoided her now included her in their daily tasks, teaching her the Apache words for plants, tools, and weather patterns. Elizabeth threw herself into learning, finding satisfaction in mastering the art of Apache weaving. Her fingers, once soft and unpracticed, now moved with growing confidence as she created a blanket of her own. Nazca watched approvingly as Elizabeth incorporated patterns she had observed in others' work. Symbols of mountains, rain, and stars woven in black and red against a natural background. Good hands, Nazca commented, touching the blanket's edge. Strong spirit. Elizabeth smiled, warmed by the praise. The patterns tell a story, yes? Will you teach me what they mean? Before Nazca could answer, commotion at the camp's edge drew their attention. The scouts had returned, Shadow Wolf among them. Elizabeth's heart quickened at the sight of him, a reaction she had stopped trying to deny to herself. That evening, as the tribe gathered around the central fire to hear the scouts' report, Elizabeth sat with Nazca. Shadow Wolf spoke at length in Apache, his deep voice carrying across the attentive crowd. Though Elizabeth caught only fragments of meaning, she noticed how the others responded to his words, with respect and trust. Later, as the gathering dispersed, Shadow Wolf approached where Elizabeth sat finishing her blanket by firelight. Your weaving improves, he said, settling beside her with a grace that belied his powerful frame. Nazcha is a patient teacher. Elizabeth ran her hand over the blanket's surface, suddenly self-conscious. The cavalry? They remain at Red Rock. More have joined. His expression revealed nothing, but Elizabeth had learned to read the tension in his shoulders. Winter comes soon. They may wait until spring to move against us. Elizabeth nodded, relief mingling with the knowledge that the threat had only been postponed, not eliminated. Shadow Wolf watched her hands as they returned to their weaving. Why did you not try to run? When I first brought you here, the question surprised her. Where would I go? Back to Bitter Creek. She shook her head. There was nothing for me there. And here? What is there for you here? Elizabeth paused, considering. I am learning to be useful, to belong. She met his gaze directly. I am not property here. A rare smile touched Shadow Wolf's lips, transforming his stern features. No, not property. Something warm unfurled in Elizabeth's chest at that smile, a feeling both frightening and exhilarating. You were educated by white men, she said, remembering the rumors she had heard in Bitter Creek. Your English is too good for it to be otherwise. Shadow Wolf was quiet for so long that Elizabeth thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke. The missionaries took several children from our band when I was young, taught us their language, their God. His jaw tightened. They tried to erase the Apache from our hearts. But they failed, Elizabeth said softly. With me, yes. Shadows crossed his face. Others never returned to the old ways. They live now in the white man's world, caught between two spirits. Elizabeth thought of her own situation, a white woman living among Apache, learning their ways yet forever marked by her difference. It's a difficult place to stand, she said. Between worlds. Shadow Wolf studied her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Yes, he agreed. But sometimes, from such a place, one can see more clearly. As they sat in companionable silence, Elizabeth continued weaving, adding a new pattern to her blanket, 2 lines that ran parallel before gradually intertwining. Nazcha, watching from her wickiup doorway, nodded to herself, seeing what both Elizabeth and Shadow Wolf had yet to fully acknowledge. Winter descended on the mountains with sudden ferocity. Snow blanketed the camp, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and beautiful. Elizabeth had never experienced such cold, the kind that burned the lungs and seeped into bones. Despite layers of rabbit fur and her carefully crafted blanket, she found herself shivering through the nights. The icy stream where the women collected water each morning became a dreaded duty. Elizabeth's hands, still not fully hardened to Apache life, cracked and bled in the cold. Still, she refused to complain, determined to prove her worth. On the coldest morning yet, Elizabeth joined 3 other women at the stream. The biting wind cut through her clothing as she knelt to fill her water skin. Dizziness swept over her suddenly, the world tilting sideways. She heard concerned voices as if from a great distance. Then nothing. Elizabeth woke in her wickiup. The fire built higher than she normally kept it. Nazcha sat nearby, grinding something in a stone mortar. When she saw Elizabeth's eyes open, she called out sharply. Moments later, Shadow Wolf ducked through the entrance, his expression immediately softening when he saw Elizabeth awake. 3 days, he said, kneeling beside her. The fever took you for 3 days. Elizabeth tried to speak, but her throat felt raw, her voice emerging as a croak. The water is collected by others, Shadow Wolf assured her. He reached for a small pouch at his waist, opening it to reveal a mixture of dried herbs and roots. You will drink this tea. It will strengthen your blood. Nazcha brought a clay cup of steaming liquid, the pungent aroma making Elizabeth's eyes water. Shadow Wolf supported her head as she sipped the bitter concoction. His hand, warm and steady against her neck, felt like an anchor in her weakness. As the days passed, Elizabeth drifted between fevered dreams and moments of lucidity. Sometimes she woke to find Nazcha tending the fire or changing the poultice on her forehead. Other times, it was Shadow Wolf who sat beside her, his deep voice reading from what sounded like a book, though the words made little sense to her addled mind. In her fever dreams, Elizabeth returned to Bitter Creek, to her father's drunken rages and the leering faces of men who saw her as merchandise. She would wake gasping, fighting against invisible hands, only to find Shadow Wolf there, his presence driving back the nightmares. On the fifth night, the fever broke. Elizabeth woke to find Shadow Wolf asleep sitting up, his back against the wicket wall, his hand resting protectively near hers on the bedding. The firelight played across his features, softening the warrior's face into something vulnerable and young. Without thinking, Elizabeth reached out, her fingers lightly touching his. Shadow Wolf's eyes opened immediately, alert even in sleep. "You're better," he said, relief evident in his voice. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. "The fever has left you. Because of your medicine," Elizabeth said, gesturing to the pouch of herbs still sitting nearby. "You saved my life." Shadow Wolf shook his head. "The plants saved you. I only know how to use them." He reached for the water skin, helping her drink. "My grandmother taught me healing ways when I was a boy." As Elizabeth drank, she noticed the dark circles under Shadow Wolf's eyes, the weariness in his posture. "You stayed with me," she said softly. "All this time." Something flickered in his expression, a moment of unguarded emotion quickly contained. "You spoke in your sleep, called out against those who hurt you." His hand tightened slightly around the water skin. "No one will hurt you here." The simple promise carried more weight than elaborate declarations. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the realization that this man, once feared as her captor, had become her protector. "Thank you," she whispered, the words wholly inadequate for what she felt. Shadow Wolf nodded once, then rose gracefully. "Rest now. Tomorrow you will be stronger." As he left the wicket, Elizabeth's gaze fell on the pouch of healing herbs, tangible proof of care she had rarely known in her life before. Spring arrived with a rush of green, transforming the landscape from winter's stark palette. Elizabeth's strength returned fully, and with it came a new status within the tribe. Her illness and recovery, and Shadow Wolf's evident concern for her, had shifted perceptions. Women who had once regarded her with suspicion now included her in their circles. Children approached her for stories of the white world, which she carefully edited to protect their innocence. But spring also brought renewed activity from the cavalry. Scouts returned with troubling reports of soldiers venturing deeper into Apache territory, marking trees and setting up small camps. Elizabeth was grinding cornmeal with two other women when Shadow Wolf approached, his expression grave. "The council gathers," he said. "Your presence is requested." The formal invitation surprised Elizabeth, but she quickly wiped her hands and followed him to the central fire where the elders had assembled. More surprising still was that several women joined the circle, the most respected grandmothers and wives of prominent warriors. Shadow Wolf took his place among the elders, gesturing for Elizabeth to sit nearby. As the council began, he occasionally translated, but Elizabeth's growing understanding of Apache allowed her to follow most of the discussion. The scouts reported that soldiers had established a permanent camp at Medicine Creek, a vital water source and sacred site. Worse, civilian surveyors accompanied them, measuring and marking the land in the white man's custom of claiming ownership. After much debate, Shadow Wolf rose and walked to the center of the circle. With a stick, he began drawing in the dirt a detailed map of the territory. Elizabeth recognized the mountain ranges, rivers, and key landmarks he marked. With careful strokes, he indicated the Apache seasonal camps, hunting grounds, and sacred sites. Then, using charcoal, he added dark marks showing soldier positions, settler encroachments, and the new camp at Medicine Creek. When he finished, he motioned Elizabeth forward. Tell them what these marks mean to your people, he said. Elizabeth knelt beside the map, acutely aware of all eyes upon her. The soldiers are creating a perimeter, she explained, Shadow Wolf translating her words. They place camps at water sources to control movement. The surveyors mark land for future settlements. She pointed to Medicine Creek. This pattern suggests they are preparing for a larger fort, not just a temporary camp. The council listened intently as Elizabeth explained the military strategy she recognized from previous expansions into Indian territories. What do they want? An elder asked through Shadow Wolf. Elizabeth hesitated, then answered truthfully. Everything. The white settlers believe it is their right, their destiny, to possess all the land from ocean to ocean. Her blunt assessment caused murmurs among the council. The war chief spoke angrily, advocating immediate action to drive the soldiers from Medicine Creek. Shadow Wolf responded calmly but firmly. Elizabeth caught enough of his words to understand his position. Direct conflict would bring overwhelming military response. What do you suggest? The eldest grandmother asked Elizabeth, her wizened face impassive. Elizabeth studied the map, thinking carefully. The soldiers follow orders. If there is trouble at Medicine Creek, more will come. But if trouble happens elsewhere, she indicated a trading post far from Apache camps. They must divide their forces. Shadow Wolf translated, adding his own thoughts. A plan emerged. Small parties would create diversions away from tribal lands while the main camp relocated deeper into the mountains. As the council concluded, the eldest elder spoke directly to Elizabeth, his words ceremonial and formal. He says you have proven yourself a friend to the people, Shadow Wolf translated. That your eyes see clearly though your skin is pale. Elizabeth bowed her head, unexpectedly moved by the acceptance. Later, as they walked from the council, Shadow Wolf's hand briefly touched her arm. You helped today, he said simply. Elizabeth looked back at the map still drawn in the dirt, already being studied by the younger warriors. I only hope it's enough, she replied, the weight of divided loyalties heavy on her heart. The council's decision required immediate action. While most of the tribe prepared to move deeper into the mountains, Shadow Wolf would lead a small diplomatic party to meet with a neighboring Apache band. Unity among the scattered bands had become essential for survival. Elizabeth watched from outside her wickiup as Shadow Wolf selected 4 warriors to accompany him. Their journey would take them through dangerous territory, past the new cavalry camp and close to settler homesteads. The risk was significant, but the alliance necessary. The evening before their departure, Elizabeth found herself unusually restless. She paced the perimeter of the camp, fingers absently tracing her mother's locket as she struggled to understand her own unease. The thought of Shadow Wolf leaving shouldn't disturb her so deeply, yet the prospect of his absence created a hollow feeling in her chest. As twilight deepened, she spotted him sitting alone by the stream that bordered the camp. Without conscious decision, her feet carried her toward him. Shadow Wolf looked up at her approach, the fading light casting his features in shadow and gold. Beside him lay his weapons, a rifle acquired through trade, a bow of remarkable craftsmanship, and a knife with an antler handle. You leave at dawn, Elizabeth said, settling on a flat rock near him. He nodded. 4 days to Yellow Knife's camp, perhaps 10 days in total. Elizabeth picked up a small stone, turning it over in her hands. The mountains are dangerous now, with so many soldiers about. Are you concerned for my safety, Elizabeth? A rare touch of humor colored his voice. She glanced up, caught by the unexpected warmth in his expression. The tribe needs your leadership, she said carefully, especially now. Shadow Wolf studied her face for a long moment. What of you? Do you need me to return? The directness of his question startled her. In Bitter Creek, men had never spoken to her with such honesty, or expected honesty in return. Yes, she admitted quietly. I would be troubled if you did not come back. The simple confession hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Shadow Wolf reached into a small pouch at his waist and withdrew something that he kept concealed in his palm. In my absence, you should continue learning our ways. Nazca will guide you. His hand extended, opening to reveal a small wooden carving of a wolf. And this will remind you that I will return. Elizabeth accepted the carving, marveling at its detail. The alert ears, the powerful shoulders, the watchful eyes that somehow captured Shadow Wolf's own steady gaze. "Did you make this?" she asked, running her finger along the smooth wood. "During the winter moons," he acknowledged. "Wood speaks to those who listen." Elizabeth closed her fingers around the carving, its weight solid and reassuring. "Thank you. I will keep it safe until you return." An awkward silence fell between them, a space filled with words neither quite knew how to say. Elizabeth sensed they stood at the edge of something profound, yet neither was ready to step forward. "The tribe will move camp the day after tomorrow," Shadow Wolf finally said. "The hunters know where to go. The elders will guide the people." He hesitated. "You will go with them." It wasn't a question, yet Elizabeth heard the uncertainty beneath his words. "Yes," she assured him. "I'll help with the children during the journey." Relief flickered across his face, quickly masked. "Good." They sat together as darkness descended fully, the night sounds of the desert rising around them. No more words passed between them, yet something had shifted, a subtle reordering of their relationship that both felt but neither named. When Elizabeth finally rose to return to her wickiup, Shadow Wolf remained by the stream. The carved wolf clutched in her hand felt like a promise, one she hadn't known she was waiting to receive. Morning came with a pale rose light spreading across the eastern sky. Elizabeth stood with the rest of the tribe as Shadow Wolf and his warriors departed, the small wooden wolf hidden in the pocket of her dress, a talisman against the fear that whispered he might not return. The tribe's new camp nestled higher in the mountains, protected by natural stone formations and hidden from casual observation. 8 days had passed since Shadow Wolf's departure. 8 days during which Elizabeth found herself counting hours, straining to hear approaching footsteps, clutching the wooden wolf carving as she fell asleep each night. She had taken on additional responsibilities, helping with the youngest children and assisting Nazca in gathering medicinal plants from their new surroundings. The work kept her hands busy but did little to quiet her mind. On the 9th day, Elizabeth was teaching 3 young girls how to weave small baskets when shouts erupted from the camp's perimeter. She rose quickly, heart pounding as warriors rushed forward with weapons ready. Through the commotion, Elizabeth saw 2 figures stumbling into the clearing, one supporting the other. With a jolt of recognition, she realized the wounded man was Shadow Wolf, his arm draped across the shoulder of his companion, his shirt dark with blood. Without thinking, Elizabeth ran forward, reaching them just as Shadow Wolf's knees buckled. She helped lower him to the ground, her hands immediately searching for the source of the bleeding. "Ambush!" his companion gasped out. "Soldiers at the crossing. The others didn't make it." Nazca appeared with her medicine bag, barking orders that sent people scattering for water, clean cloths, and specific plants. Elizabeth helped remove Shadow Wolf's shirt, revealing an arrow wound in his shoulder, the shaft broken off but the head still embedded in the muscle. "Hold him," Nazca instructed Elizabeth in Apache. Elizabeth positioned herself behind Shadow Wolf, cradling his head and shoulders in her lap. His skin burned with fever, his breathing labored but steady. As Nazca worked to extract the arrowhead, Shadow Wolf's body tensed with pain. Elizabeth held him firmly, murmuring soothing words in a mixture of English and Apache. When the bloodied arrowhead finally came free, Shadow Wolf's eyes flickered open, focusing hazily on Elizabeth's face above him. "Elizabeth," he whispered, then continued in Apache, his voice thick with delirium. Nazca glanced up sharply at his words, her weathered face unreadable as she continued cleaning the wound. What did he say? Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling slightly. The old woman shook her head, returning to her task. Fever talk. Nothing. But Elizabeth had caught enough Apache to recognize endearments in Shadow Wolf's feverish murmuring, words she had heard between married couples in the tribe. Her cheeks flushed as she continued supporting him through Nazca's ministrations. That night, Elizabeth refused to leave Shadow Wolf's side. The warriors had moved him to his wickiup, where Elizabeth sat vigilant, applying cool cloths to his forehead and helping Nazca change the poultices on his wound. His fever raged, bringing moments of consciousness interspersed with delirious rambling. During one lucid interval, Shadow Wolf gripped Elizabeth's hand with surprising strength. The mission failed, he said, his voice hoarse. Yellow Knife's band was gone. Soldiers had already been there. Save your strength, Elizabeth urged, but Shadow Wolf continued. They followed us, waited at the river crossing. His breathing grew labored. Thomos and Natani fell first. Keem and I escaped, but they hunt us still. Elizabeth's throat tightened at the news of the fallen warriors, men she had come to know over the months of living among the Apache. Rest now, she said, smoothing a hand over his brow. The tribe is safe here. You're safe. Shadow Wolf's dark eyes fixed on her face with sudden clarity. I feared I would not see you again, he admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. In the water, with arrows falling around us, it was your face I saw. Elizabeth's heart stuttered at the raw emotion in his voice. Before she could respond, his eyes drifted closed, exhaustion claiming him once more. As the night deepened, Elizabeth remained by his side, the blood-stained arrowhead placed carefully among his medicine items, a grim trophy of survival. Outside, she could hear the camp's subdued movements as watches were doubled and preparations made for possible pursuit. Shadow Wolf's fever-induced confessions had shifted something fundamental between them. Words spoken in vulnerability that could never be unheard. 3 days passed before Shadow Wolf's fever broke. During that time, Elizabeth rarely left his side, sleeping in brief snatches while sitting upright against the wickiup wall. The tribe's council met frequently, debating their next course of action as scouts reported increased military activity in the foothills. On the fourth morning, Elizabeth woke to find Shadow Wolf watching her, his eyes clear of fever's haze. You stayed, he said simply. Elizabeth straightened, self-consciously smoothing her hair. Of course. Shadow Wolf attempted to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing wound. Elizabeth quickly moved to assist him, arranging blankets to support his back. The scouts bring troubling news, he said once settled. The blue coats search many areas at once. They have enlisted civilians, trappers who know these mountains. Elizabeth had heard fragments of these reports during her brief absences from the wickiup. They're searching for your band specifically? Shadow Wolf nodded grimly. They blame us for raids conducted by others. A supply wagon was attacked near Bitter Creek. 6 settlers killed. His jaw tightened. We were far from there when it happened, but the soldiers do not care which Apache they find. A cold dread settled in Elizabeth's stomach. There are innocent people who will be caught in this. Families who have done no harm. She thought suddenly of the Millers, a quiet family who had shown her kindness during her life in Bitter Creek. Their homestead sat isolated in a valley that the Apache sometimes passed through. If the army is moving through the region with orders to attack Apache bands, they will not distinguish between those who fight and those who do not. Shadow Wolf finished, understanding her concern. Elizabeth retrieved a small leather-bound journal from her belongings, a gift from a tribal member who occasionally traded with Mexican settlers. She had been using it to record Apache words and medicinal plants, the pencil worn to a stub. There's a family, she explained, opening the journal to a blank page. The Millers. They were kind to me when few others were. Their homestead lies here. She sketched a rough map, indicating the valley's location relative to their current camp. They have young children, Shadow Wolf. He studied her drawing, his expression grave. You wish to warn them? It wasn't a question, but Elizabeth nodded anyway. They could leave before the fighting reaches them. She hesitated, then added firmly, I need to do this. Shadow Wolf was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. It is dangerous. The soldiers are everywhere. I know these mountains now, Elizabeth countered, and I can travel as a white woman again if needed. She gestured to her Apache clothing. They won't suspect me. You would go alone? There was a note in his voice Elizabeth couldn't quite identify. Concern, perhaps, or something deeper. Yes, she began, then faltered at the look that crossed his face. No, Shadow Wolf said with quiet authority. Not alone. He began to rise, ignoring Elizabeth's protests. We leave at dawn tomorrow. You're wound. Is healing, he interrupted. And the journey will be easier with two. His tone softened slightly. These people were kind to you. I honor that. But I will not let you face such danger alone. Elizabeth knew better than to argue with the stubborn set of his jaw. 2 days' journey if we're careful, she said instead, returning to her map. We'll need to avoid the main trails. That evening, as they made preparations, one of the elders approached with obvious disapproval. He spoke rapidly to Shadow Wolf, gesturing toward Elizabeth with barely concealed suspicion. Shadow Wolf's response was calm but firm. When the elder had departed, still clearly unhappy, Elizabeth asked, What did he say? He fears you lead me into a trap, Shadow Wolf replied honestly. That you use my regard for you to bring soldiers upon us. Elizabeth's chest tightened at the implication, both the accusation and the acknowledgement of Shadow Wolf's feelings. And what did you tell him? She asked quietly. Shadow Wolf met her gaze steadily. That I trust you with my life, and the life of my people. The simple declaration hung between them, weighted with meaning that transcended words. Elizabeth's hand moved unconsciously to touch the wooden wolf carving she now kept always in her pocket. We leave before first light, Shadow Wolf said softly. Rest now. But rest proved elusive as Elizabeth lay awake, contemplating the journey ahead, and the man who would risk everything to help her save a family he had never met, simply because they had once shown her kindness. They traveled through shadow, leaving before the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. Elizabeth wore a mixture of her Apache clothing and items traded from Mexican settlers, a compromise that would draw less attention if they were spotted from a distance. Shadow Wolf moved with deliberate care, his wounded shoulder still tender but his steps sure as he led them through hidden passes and narrow ravines. By midday, they had covered significant ground, pausing only briefly to drink from a clear stream that cut through the rocky terrain. Elizabeth watched Shadow Wolf scan their surroundings, his senses attuned to dangers she might miss. How is your shoulder? She asked as they rested in the shade of a towering pine. It serves, he replied simply, though Elizabeth noticed how he favored his uninjured side. They continued as the sun began its westward descent, speaking little but sharing a companionable silence born of mutual trust. Twice, Shadow Wolf halted abruptly, raising a hand for stillness. Each time, they waited motionless until he was satisfied they were alone before proceeding. As dusk approached, they reached a sheltered canyon, a natural fortress with high walls and a single narrow entrance. Shadow Wolf led Elizabeth to a small cave set back from the canyon floor. We will camp here tonight, he said, inspecting the cave entrance for signs of recent occupation. It is safe. Elizabeth gathered dry brush for a small, sheltered fire while Shadow Wolf set snares for rabbits. The domesticity of their actions struck her suddenly. How naturally they worked together, anticipating each other's needs without discussion. With night came a blanket of stars more brilliant than any Elizabeth had ever seen. After their simple meal of dried corn cakes and a single rabbit Shadow Wolf had caught, they sat outside the cave entrance, the canyon walls protecting their small fire from distant eyes. Shadow Wolf used a stick to draw patterns in the sand between them, a circle with radiating lines. "The stars," he explained, pointing upward to where the real stars mirrored his drawing. "My people see the world written in the sky." Elizabeth followed his gaze upward, marveling at the vast expanse. "What do they say about us?" she asked softly. "The stars." Shadow Wolf was quiet for a moment, his face illuminated by firelight and starshine. "They speak of paths crossing." His finger traced new lines in the sand, creating intricate patterns. Some for a season, some for a lifetime. Elizabeth watched his hands, strong, capable hands that she had seen take life in hunting and give comfort in healing. "And our paths?" she ventured, heart quickening. "What do the stars say of them?" Shadow Wolf's eyes met hers across the small fire. "That is for us to decide," he said. "Stars can guide, but they cannot choose." The weight of unspoken feelings hung between them like the very air they breathed. Elizabeth looked back to the heavens, searching for courage in their ancient light. "I was afraid," she admitted quietly, "when you didn't return. I thought," she swallowed hard, "I thought I might never see you again." "I fought to return," Shadow Wolf said, his voice dropping to match her hushed tone. "Not just to my people, but to you." Elizabeth's gaze dropped to her hands, twisted nervously in her lap. "I don't know what that means," she whispered. "For either of us." Shadow Wolf moved then, circling the fire to sit beside her. Not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the night's chill. "It means," he said carefully, "that what began as duty has become choice." Elizabeth looked up at him, finding his face inches from her own. "I'm not what your people would choose for you," she said, giving voice to her deepest fear. "I am not what your people would choose for you," he countered gently. A small, sad smile touched Elizabeth's lips. "My people threw me away." Shadow Wolf's hand rose slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, before his fingers brushed her cheek. "Then they were blind to your value." The simple truth in his words broke something inside Elizabeth, a dam holding back emotions too powerful to name. Tears spilled over, tracking silently down her cheeks. Without hesitation, Shadow Wolf drew her into his arms, mindful of his wounded shoulder. Against the solid warmth of his chest, Elizabeth felt years of loneliness begin to dissolve. "I'm afraid," she confessed into the quiet space between heartbeats. Shadow Wolf's reply rumbled beneath her ear. "Of what?" "Of feeling this much," she whispered. "Of losing it again." His arms tightened around her, a silent promise in their strength. Above them, the ancient stars continued their eternal dance, bearing witness to two souls finding harbor in each other's hearts. Dawn found them moving again, navigating narrow game trails that wound through the mountains. Something had shifted between them, a new awareness that manifested in brief touches, lingering glances, and words chosen with careful tenderness. Yet beneath this fragile joy lurked the reality of their situation, a world increasingly hostile to their bond. By midday, they crested a ridge that offered a clear view of the valley below. The Miller homestead was visible in the distance, a small cabin with outbuildings nestled against the foothills. "Smoke from the chimney," Elizabeth observed. "They're still there." Shadow Wolf nodded, his expression growing grave as he studied the surrounding terrain. "And they are not alone." He pointed to a distant glint of metal near the creek that ran behind the property. With growing dread, Elizabeth recognized the unmistakable silhouette of cavalry tents partially hidden among the trees. "A patrol," Shadow Wolf confirmed. "Perhaps 15 men." Elizabeth's heart sank. "They're using the homestead as a base." "Or watching it," Shadow Wolf suggested. "If they suspect the Millers have had contact with Apache." The implications were clear. If soldiers were monitoring the homestead, Approaching openly would be dangerous for both them and the Miller family. We need to get closer, Elizabeth decided. Observe before acting. They descended carefully, using natural cover to approach within a safer viewing distance. From their new vantage point behind a cluster of boulders, Elizabeth could see activity around the cabin. Mrs. Miller hung laundry while her 2 young children played in the yard. Of Mr. Miller there was no sign. The cavalry camp showed 5 tents, with horses picketed nearby. A sentry stood watching the cabin, rifle in hand. Something is wrong, Elizabeth murmured. The children are playing, but Mrs. Miller seems tense. Shadow Wolf's eyes narrowed as he studied the scene. The woman keeps looking toward the soldiers. She is afraid. A movement near the tree line caught Elizabeth's attention. A cavalry officer emerged, speaking to the sentry before heading toward the cabin. Even at this distance, the arrogant bearing was unmistakable. Captain Thornton, Elizabeth whispered, a chill running through her. Why would he be at such a small outpost? Shadow Wolf's expression darkened. Because he hunts bigger prey than random Apache. Before Elizabeth could respond, he pulled something from inside his shirt, a folded paper that he carefully smoothed against the rock. Elizabeth gasped softly as she recognized a wanted poster bearing a crude but recognizable sketch of Shadow Wolf's face. Below the image, bold letters proclaimed, $500 reward for the Apache called Shadow Wolf, dead or alive. Where did you get this? She asked, her voice barely audible. It was pinned to a tree near our last camp, Shadow Wolf replied grimly. Thornton does not hunt just any Apache. He hunts me specifically. Elizabeth stared at the poster, the implications hitting her like a physical blow. This wasn't random military action. It was a targeted hunt for the man beside her. We need to leave, she said urgently. If Thornton is here, your friends remain in danger, Shadow Wolf reminded her gently. Perhaps greater danger if Thornton uses them as bait. Elizabeth's gaze returned to the homestead, where Mrs. Miller now hurried her children inside as the captain approached. I could go alone, she suggested reluctantly. As a white woman, I might get close enough to warn them. The look Shadow Wolf gave her contained such fierce protectiveness that it stole her breath. And if they question how you know of danger? If they ask where you have been these months? He shook his head firmly. They would arrest you as an Indian sympathizer. Then what do we do? Elizabeth asked, frustration edging her voice. We can't just abandon them. Shadow Wolf studied the homestead thoughtfully. Tonight, he decided, when darkness provides cover, I can approach without being seen. We, Elizabeth corrected, we can approach. Shadow Wolf started to object, but something in Elizabeth's expression stopped him. Instead, he nodded once, accepting her partnership in this risk. As they settled to wait for nightfall, Elizabeth found her fingers tracing the edges of the wanted poster. The crude likeness captured nothing of the man she had come to know, the gentleness behind his strength, the wisdom beneath his silence. Why you? She asked softly. Why does Thornton hunt you specifically? Shadow Wolf's eyes remained fixed on the distant cabin, but his voice carried old pain when he finally answered. Because I once trusted him, and he has never forgiven me for witnessing his dishonor. Twilight settled over the valley, bringing long shadows that stretched like spectral fingers across the land. From their hiding place, Elizabeth and Shadow Wolf observed the cavalry camp's evening routine, guards changing, cook fires being lit, men gathering for their evening meal. There is something you should know, Shadow Wolf said as they shared the last of their journey provisions. About Thornton. Elizabeth listened as Shadow Wolf recounted his history with the captain. How as a young man, he had been one of the Apache children taken to the white man's school. There, he had met Lieutenant Thornton, then an ambitious young officer assigned to the school as punishment for some minor infraction. He used the children as scouts, Shadow Wolf explained, his voice devoid of emotion. promising we would help protect our people by showing the army where hostile bands camped. But Thornton had lied. The information was used to attack peaceful villages, including one where Shadow Wolf's uncle and cousins lived. When Shadow Wolf confronted him, Thornton had him whipped and imprisoned. I escaped, Shadow Wolf finished simply. Returned to my people. Since then, he has hunted me as a symbol of his failure. Elizabeth's hand found his in the gathering darkness. I'm sorry. As night fully descended, they finalized their plan. They would circle behind the cabin, using the creek as cover to approach from the direction least visible to the cavalry camp. Elizabeth would create a distraction at the rear door while Shadow Wolf slipped inside to warn the family. They moved with careful silence through the darkness, the quarter moon providing just enough light to navigate. As they neared the creek, Elizabeth froze at a sound ahead, voices low and urgent. Shadow Wolf pulled her into the shadow of a large boulder as two figures emerged from behind the cabin, making their way toward the creek. In the dim moonlight, Elizabeth recognized Mrs. Miller and a man who must be her husband. They carried small bundles and were leading their two children, who had been wrapped in dark blankets for silence and warmth. They're leaving, Elizabeth whispered. They already know the danger. Shadow Wolf nodded, relieved but wary. We should still warn them about the patrols to the north. They waited until the family reached the creek bank before Elizabeth stepped forward, calling Mrs. Miller's name in the softest voice that would carry. The woman turned with a startled gasp, clutching her children closer. Mr. Miller raised a rifle defensively. It's Elizabeth Harmon, she called softly, stepping into a patch of moonlight where they could see her face. I've come to warn you. Recognition dawned in Mrs. Miller's tired face. Elizabeth? We thought you were dead. Elizabeth approached slowly, aware of the rifle still trained on her. You need to head east through Thompson's Pass, she advised quickly. The northern routes are being patrolled. Why should we trust you? Mr. Miller demanded, his voice tight with suspicion. Folks in town say you've been living with Indians. Because I'm risking my life to help you, Elizabeth replied steadily. And yes, I've been with the Apache. They're not what people claim. Mrs. Miller touched her husband's arm, lowering the rifle. She's right about the patrols. Jenkins from the South Farm tried that way 2 days ago. They brought his body back yesterday. Shadow Wolf emerged from the shadows then, causing Mr. Miller to raise his rifle again. No! Elizabeth stepped between them. He's with me. He helped me come warn you. The standoff lasted several tense heartbeats before Mrs. Miller again intervened. Frank, they're risking everything to help us. Look at her. She's not a prisoner. Mr. Miller lowered his weapon reluctantly. The soldiers came 3 days ago, he explained gruffly. Said they were hunting Apache raiders, but they're using our home like they own it. Taking our food, sleeping in our barn. Captain Thornton, Elizabeth guessed. Mrs. Miller nodded, fear evident in her eyes. He asked about you, Elizabeth. Showed us a sketch of an Apache man, asking if we'd seen either of you. Elizabeth and Shadow Wolf exchanged alarmed glances. You must go quickly, Shadow Wolf urged. Take the eastern pass, then turn south after the Twin Peaks. As the family prepared to depart, Mrs. Miller impulsively embraced Elizabeth. Be careful, she whispered. That captain. There's something wrong in his eyes when he speaks of you. They watched as the Millers disappeared into the darkness, the children's silent bundles in their parents' arms. They'll be safe now, Elizabeth said, turning to Shadow Wolf. But his attention had shifted, his body suddenly tense. Riders, he warned, his voice barely audible. Coming from the camp. Before they could retreat, hoofbeats rounded the cabin, lanterns cutting through the darkness. Elizabeth made a split-second decision, shoving Shadow Wolf toward the creek. Run, she commanded. I'll delay them. Before he could protest, she stepped into the open, where the approaching riders couldn't miss her, or the long braid she quickly cut from her hair and pressed into Shadow Wolf's hand as the final token of her choice. The soldiers surrounded Elizabeth within moments, lanterns illuminating her face and the Apache clothing she wore. She kept her eyes lowered, conscious of the creek bank behind her where Shadow Wolf had disappeared into the darkness. Well, a cold voice drawled. Elizabeth Harmon, back from the dead. Captain Thornton dismounted, his polished boots gleaming in the lantern light as he approached. He was taller than Elizabeth remembered, with sharp features and eyes that reminded her of ice over deep water. Captain, she acknowledged, forcing her voice to remain steady. Where are the Millers? He demanded, glancing toward the silent cabin. Elizabeth shrugged. Gone before I arrived. Thornton circled her slowly, taking in her buckskin dress, beaded moccasins, and newly shortened hair. You've gone native, he observed with distaste. Though I'm not surprised. Always heard you were trash. She remained silent, refusing to rise to the bait. Every moment she kept Thornton focused on her was another moment for Shadow Wolf to escape. Where is he? Thornton asked abruptly. Your Apache lover. I don't know what you mean, Elizabeth replied, meeting his gaze steadily. The captain's hand shot out, gripping her jaw painfully. Don't play stupid with me, girl. My scouts have been tracking you both since yesterday. His fingers tightened. Where is Shadow Wolf? Gone, Elizabeth answered truthfully. Far from here by now. Thornton released her with a shove that sent her stumbling backward. Search the area, he barked to his men. He can't have gotten far. As soldiers fanned out, Thornton returned his attention to Elizabeth. You know, your father was quite helpful when we visited Bitter Creek. Told us all about how his daughter had been taken by the Apache called Shadow Wolf. Elizabeth's stomach clenched at the mention of her father. Of course, Thornton continued. He neglected to mention the considerable gambling debts that prompted the transaction. Fortunately, the saloon keeper was more forthcoming. My father always did value whiskey over truth, Elizabeth said bitterly. Thornton's mouth twisted into what might have been a smile on a different man. He also suggested you might have developed sympathies for your captor. I dismissed it as the ramblings of a drunk. His eyes narrowed. Perhaps I was too hasty. A shout from the creek bank interrupted them. A soldier approached, holding something in his outstretched hand. Found this by the water, sir. Elizabeth's heart sank as she recognized the wooden wolf carving that must have fallen from her pocket during the confrontation. Thornton examined it, his expression darkening. Search harder, he snapped. He's close. Two soldiers seized Elizabeth's arms while another produced iron handcuffs. The cold metal bit into her wrists as Thornton watched with satisfaction. Elizabeth Harmon, you are under arrest for aiding and abetting enemies of the United States, he announced formally. Your Apache sympathies have made you a traitor. Elizabeth lifted her chin defiantly. The only traitor here is the man who betrayed children in his care. Thornton's face contorted with rage. His hand flashed out, striking Elizabeth across the face with enough force to split her lip. Bind her to my horse, he ordered coldly. We'll return to the main camp. She'll talk once she's had time to consider her situation. As the soldier secured her to Thornton's mount, Elizabeth caught a flicker of movement on the distant ridge. A shadow briefly silhouetted against the night sky. Her heart both soared and plummeted. Shadow Wolf had escaped, but he was watching. She prayed he would have the wisdom to stay away. The journey to the main cavalry camp was brutal. Bound to Thornton's saddle, Elizabeth was forced to jog alongside the horse or be dragged. By the time they arrived at a larger encampment nestled in a valley clearing, her legs were trembling with exhaustion and her wrists raw beneath the handcuffs. Soldiers stared as she was led through the camp, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled contempt for the Indian lover. Elizabeth kept her gaze forward, refusing to show weakness. Thornton ordered her confined in a supply tent under guard. "She knows where Shadow Wolf and his band are hiding," he informed his lieutenant. "By morning, she'll be eager to tell us everything." Left alone with her hands still cuffed, Elizabeth sank onto a crate, her mind racing. She had no illusions about what morning would bring. Thornton's methods of interrogation were notorious among the Apache. Touching her bruised face gingerly, Elizabeth felt a strange calm descend. Whatever happened now, she had made her choice. Shadow Wolf was safe, at least for the moment. The wooden wolf carving might be lost, but she carried something more permanent now, the knowledge that she had found a love worth sacrificing everything for. Dawn broke with the harsh clarity that precedes full heat in the mountains. Elizabeth, who had not slept, heard the camp stirring to life around her. Boot steps, muttered conversations, the clatter of cook pots. Her wrists had swollen around the handcuffs, the metal edges cutting into tender flesh. The tent flap opened, admitting Thornton and 2 soldiers. The captain looked fresh and rested, his uniform immaculate save for the dust of the trail. "Miss Harmon," he greeted her with mock courtesy. "I trust you've reconsidered your position." Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "I have nothing to tell you." Thornton's expression hardened. "Your Apache friends raided a settlement 2 days ago. 3 women and a child killed." He watched her face carefully. "Their blood is on your hands as much as theirs." "Shadow Wolf's band hasn't raided any settlements," Elizabeth replied with certainty. "They've been in the high country for weeks." A thin smile crossed Thornton's face. "So you do know where they are." Elizabeth realized her mistake too late. She pressed her lips together, refusing to compound her error. "Take her outside," Thornton ordered. "Perhaps public humiliation will loosen her tongue." The soldiers dragged her into the center of the camp, where a post had been set up, a grim reminder of military discipline. One soldier removed her handcuffs while another bound her wrists to the post, arms stretched painfully above her head. "Elizabeth Harmon," Thornton announced loudly, addressing the gathered soldiers. "Once a respectable white woman, now an Apache whore and traitor to her race." He circled her slowly. "She protects the savage who has murdered countless settlers, including women and children." Murmurs ran through the assembled men. Elizabeth kept her eyes forward, refusing to show fear despite the knot of terror in her stomach. "I'll ask you once more," Thornton said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Where is Shadow Wolf?" "I don't know," she answered truthfully. Thornton nodded to a soldier who stepped forward with a whip. 5 lashes, the captain ordered. To start. The camp fell silent. Elizabeth closed her eyes, bracing herself for the first blow. It never came. Instead, a commotion erupted at the edge of the camp. Elizabeth opened her eyes to see soldiers running toward the disturbance, weapons raised. "Captain!" a sergeant called urgently. "Apache!" Walking right into camp. Elizabeth's heart stuttered as Shadow Wolf appeared between 2 armed soldiers, his hands raised in surrender. He wore no weapons, his face a mask of calm dignity despite the rifles pointed at his chest. "No," she whispered, despair washing through her. "No, no, no." Thornton's face lit with savage triumph. "Shadow Wolf," he said, savoring the name. "How considerate of you to save me the trouble of hunting you down." Shadow Wolf's eyes met Elizabeth's across the camp, a world of meaning passing between them before he faced Thornton. "I come freely," he stated, his deep voice carrying across the suddenly silent camp. "In exchange for her release." Thornton laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "You're not in a position to negotiate." "Am I not?" Shadow Wolf countered calmly. "You want me, not her. I offer myself willingly. After I have you both?" Thornton gestured to his men, who roughly seized Shadow Wolf, binding his hands behind his back. "Bring him here." They forced Shadow Wolf to kneel before the post where Elizabeth remained bound. Up close, She could see the fatigue in his face, the dried blood on his reopened shoulder wound. "Why?" she asked brokenly. "Why did you come back?" His eyes held hers, filled with a tenderness that made her want to weep. "You know why." Thornton circled them like a predator savoring its prey. "How touching," he mocked. "The savage and his white squaw." He drew his pistol, checking the chamber methodically. "You've led me on quite a chase, Shadow Wolf. 5 years I've hunted you." He aimed the weapon at Shadow Wolf's head. "Perhaps I should end it now." Elizabeth strained against her bonds. "He surrendered peacefully. Military law requires." "Military law?" Thornton cut her off. "Doesn't apply to Indian renegades." His cold eyes flicked to her. "Or to white traders." Shadow Wolf remained perfectly still, his dignity undiminished by his position. "If you kill me now," he said quietly, "you will never know where my people are." A calculating look crossed Thornton's face. He lowered the pistol slightly. "You'd betray your own people for her?" "No," Shadow Wolf answered, "but I would negotiate for her freedom." Thornton holstered his weapon, clearly intrigued by the possibility of a greater victory. "Take him to the prisoner tent," he ordered. "Double the guard." As soldiers dragged Shadow Wolf away, his eyes found Elizabeth's one last time. In them she read not defeat but determination, and something that looked strangely like hope. Only when they'd gone did Elizabeth notice what lay in the dust where Shadow Wolf had knelt. His prized bow, snapped in two during his capture. The broken weapon seemed to symbolize everything that had been sacrificed in the name of love. Night descended on the cavalry camp, bringing with it an unnatural stillness. Elizabeth, now confined in the same tent as Shadow Wolf, watched as he sat in meditation, seemingly untouched by their dire circumstances. Their guards had bound them back to back, close enough to speak in whispers but unable to see each other's faces. "Why did you surrender?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely audible. "You could have been safe with your people." "There is no safety if you are not there," Shadow Wolf replied simply. Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes. "Thornton will execute you at dawn. You know that." "Perhaps." His calm acceptance infuriated and awed her in equal measure. "But night is long, and much can happen before dawn." Outside, a sentry called the hour. Elizabeth strained against her bonds, wincing as the rope cut into her already raw wrists. "What do you mean?" Before Shadow Wolf could answer, the distant call of an owl echoed through the night, 3 distinct hoots followed by 2 shorter ones. She felt Shadow Wolf's body tense against hers. "My people come," he whispered. Elizabeth's heart raced. "Your band? But how?" "I left signs. Keem can read them." The pride in his voice was evident. "They will not abandon us." The realization of what was coming filled Elizabeth with both hope and dread. "There will be bloodshed." "Yes," Shadow Wolf acknowledged, "but perhaps not as much as Thornton expects." They fell silent as a guard approached their tent, peering inside before continuing his rounds. When his footsteps faded, Shadow Wolf spoke again. "When it begins, stay low. When I give the signal, run for the trees to the north." Elizabeth twisted, trying unsuccessfully to see his face. "I won't leave you." His fingers, bound though they were, somehow found hers. "You must live, Elizabeth. For both of us if necessary." "No," she said fiercely. "I won't do it. Not after everything." Shadow Wolf's grip tightened. "Then we must both survive." The night deepened. Sentries called fewer updates as most of the camp settled into sleep. Only Thornton's tent still showed lamplight, his shadow occasionally visible against the canvas wall. The attack, when it came, was as silent as falling snow. First, the perimeter guards disappeared one by one. Then dark figures moved through the camp, disabling horses and collecting weapons. Elizabeth heard only the softest whispers of movement, a testament to Apache stealth. Shadow Wolf worked steadily at their bonds, using a small shard of metal he had concealed in his moccasin. When the ropes finally gave way, he turned to face Elizabeth, cupping her face in his hands. "Whatever happens," he said urgently, "know that meeting you changed my path in ways I never imagined possible." Before she could respond, chaos erupted. War cries shattered the night as Apache warriors fully revealed their presence. Gunshots cracked, men shouted in alarm, and the camp dissolved into frantic activity. Shadow Wolf pulled Elizabeth to her feet. "Now!" They burst from the tent into pandemonium. Soldiers fired blindly into the darkness while Apache warriors struck from all sides. Shadow Wolf led Elizabeth through the mayhem with unerring precision, dodging bullets and fighting when necessary. They had nearly reached the tree line when a figure loomed before them. Thornton, his uniform disheveled, his eyes wild with hatred as he raised his pistol. "You won't escape me," he snarled, aiming at Shadow Wolf's heart. Elizabeth didn't think. She threw herself forward just as the gun discharged, feeling a searing pain across her side. Shadow Wolf roared with fury, tackling Thornton to the ground. The men struggled, Thornton's military training matched against Shadow Wolf's desperate strength. Elizabeth, pressing her hand against her bleeding side, watched in horror as Thornton's hand closed around a fallen knife. She cried out a warning, but Shadow Wolf had already seen the danger. With a swift, decisive movement, he caught Thornton's wrist and turned the blade. Thornton's eyes widened in shock as his own knife entered his chest. "You, savage!" he gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "No," Shadow Wolf replied, rising to his feet. "Just a man protecting what he loves." Keem appeared from the shadows, signaling that their escape route was clear. Shadow Wolf lifted Elizabeth gently, carrying her despite his own wounds. "The others will cover our retreat," he assured her as they melted into the forest. Hours later, safe in a hidden canyon far from the cavalry camp, Elizabeth sat wrapped in blankets as Nazca tended her wound, a painful but shallow graze that would heal cleanly. "What now?" she asked Shadow Wolf, who hadn't left her side since their escape. He smiled, the expression transforming his warrior's face. "We choose our path. Together." 2 months later, Elizabeth stood beside Shadow Wolf in a sacred circle of stones high in the mountains. Dressed in ceremonial Apache attire adorned with beads and quillwork, she listened as he spoke the traditional vows in his language, then repeated her own in English. Nazca blessed their union, tying their hands together with a beautifully woven cord. The small gathering of Shadow Wolf's most trusted band members witnessed the blending of two worlds in one ceremony. That night, as they sat before their own fire, Elizabeth's hand rested gently on her still flat stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said softly. Shadow Wolf's eyes widened as he understood her meaning. His hand covered hers, wonder spreading across his features. In the years that followed, their child would grow in the sheltered valley where they eventually settled, far from cavalry patrols and prejudiced towns. Other outcasts joined them over time. Mixed-blood children, women escaping abuse, men seeking peace rather than conflict. Their community became a hidden bridge between worlds. And among their most treasured possessions was a small cradle board, lovingly carved by Shadow Wolf's hands, decorated with symbols from both their cultures, a testament to love that transcended boundaries set by those who would keep them apart.